Good evening. I'm calling to order the regular meeting of the Euclid Board of Education. Today is February 10th, and we are meeting at the Fordyce Building. Would you please stand and join me for the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Call the roll, please.
Mrs. DeAngelis.
Here.
Mrs. Lysy.
Here.
Mrs. Sudar.
Here.
Mrs. Thomas.
Here.
Mrs. Van Hoen.
Here.
All members are present.
Thank you. We have a motion to adopt the minutes of January 13th and 27th. So moved. Moved by Mrs. Lysy, second.
Second.
By Mrs. DeAngelis. Call the roll, please.
Mrs. Lysy.
Yes.
Mrs. Sudar.
Yes.
Mrs. Thomas.
Yes.
Mrs. Van Hoen.
Yes.
Mrs. DeAngelis.
Yes.
Motion carries 5-0.
Thank you. Do we have a legislative liaison report, Mrs. Lysy?
Yeah, we do. I have a couple of tidbits of information to share. But before I share that information, I thought I would just kind of go over, for the benefit of our new board member Tisha Thomas, I'll go over what a legislative liaison is and what we do. Every January, school boards across the state of Ohio have their organizational meetings where they go ahead and appoint or retain the current board president, vice president, and then they appoint a student achievement liaison and a legislative liaison, and then other board members to be part of other committees at the state level or in the city or urban leagues, whatever they may belong to. The legislative liaison is responsible for a few things. One is that we want to maintain a relationship and open communication with our state legislators so that we could inform them of the impact that certain policies and mandates at the state level would impact our district in particular, or districts similar to us. The other thing that we do is we get a weekly update from the Ohio School Boards Association. It's called Facts in a Flash, and that is a good opportunity once a month to update school board members on what's going on at the state and sometimes at the federal level too. But something new this year that I wasn't aware of when I was legislative liaison a few years back was that they are now at the Ohio School Boards Association are advocating that all board members join the Kids PAC, which is a political action committee, where is made up of board members. And to be a member of this PAC, you would need to make a donation only up to about $100, anywhere in that range. And it is to help advocate for districts and education legislation that affects all of the students in the state of Ohio. I have additional information for that, and I haven't compiled all of it yet, but I thought I would pass it out to each of the board members. So if that is something that any of us are interested in doing, you'll have the information to decide whether or not you want to go ahead and be a member of the PAC, or the Kids PAC. So with that, last week I received our Facts in a Flash update, which is a legislative update from the Ohio School Boards Association. Not much has been happening last week. Basically, this week is when a lot of committees are meeting. But one committee in particular I thought was interesting was the Senate Finance Committee. They are going to be meeting this week again. They met last week, and her testimony from OSBO, I guess is how you pronounce it, the Ohio Association of School Business Officials. OASBO. And then also from BASA, which is the Buckeye Association of School Administrators. And what they did were, they're advocating on behalf of Senate Bill 231. And what that is legislation that would permit boards of education to use proceeds that they receive from the sale of real property within a district to be used in or used for construction or acquisition of permanent improvements. So currently how the law stands, if a school district will sell real property, the revenue generated from that sale has to go to forgive the debt on that property. And if there's anything left over, any revenue left over after that debt is paid, then that money has to be put into a certain fund and only can be used for two things. Those two things are non-operating capital expenses that are related to technology infrastructure and equipment to be used for instruction or assessment. So if we, and the only reason I bring this up is when we were down in Albuquerque, Mr. Vasic and I went to a workshop to see how we might be able to bring in different revenue streams outside of our tax base. one of the ideas that was submitted or proposed was the leasing or selling of real property in order, now that's a one-time income, or one-time revenue stream. And what they're finding is a lot of districts are having to resort to that. And so what this bill does is it just sort of gives school boards more flexibility on how they're going to spend that money. So what the bill will do is a few things. It will allow boards of education to sell real property under Section 3313.41 of the revised code, and the proceeds received from that sale shall be used for either of the following purposes. One, the retirement of any debt that was incurred by the district with respect to that real property, which is the original bill, or the original law. Proceeds in excess of the funds necessary to retire that debt may be paid into the school district capital and maintenance fund and used only to pay for costs of non-operating capital expenses, which are related to technology, infrastructure, or equipment to be used in instruction and assessment. Additionally, payment can then be made also into a special fund for construction or acquisition of permanent improvements. So all they're doing is adding flexibility for school boards so that if we have new school buildings that already have infrastructure for technology, and we at some point might sell some real property, what are we going to do with that? We might want to help maintain the facilities that we are going to be getting in the next couple of years. And so I'm going to go ahead and contact Senator Gardner and Height, who are who are sponsoring this bill, because I think this would definitely be a benefit to our district. I had a chance to talk to Mr. Higley this morning, and he said absolutely, because I remember even Ken Smith saying that there is certain property in this district that has been discussed for sale or lease. And we would like to have the flexibility to do something with those proceeds instead of what the law says. So I'm going to go ahead and pursue this.
Would that be the same as members of the board, Mrs. Lysy? Would that be the same as with the lease, so that we leased it? Because that's what I'm thinking.
And that's why I called Mr. Higley today, because I wasn't sure, and I knew that that was something that we had discussed. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I think I need to go ahead and contact these two senators and find out if the lease of a lease agreement would be, that those proceeds from a lease agreement of real property can go into a special fund that we could use for other than technology, infrastructure, and assessments. So, and then just one last tidbit of information. There should be a vote today. They're trying to add, 4 more calamity days, and that's House Bill 416. So they're expecting a vote either this week or next week. So we'll know in a few weeks, hopefully, whether or not they're going to extend the calamity days. So, and I'll make sure I let everybody know if that happens, because I know our kids certainly would like to know that too. So, all right, and that concludes my report.
Thank you, Mrs. Lysy. I will say something on the Kids PAC, because I've been a member for a number of years now. And actually, you can be a member just with a $25 donation, up to $100. And if you give more than, I think it's 35 or something, you get a pin, which I have several now. But it really is worthwhile to do, just to help support OSBA in their lobbying for our benefit. So I would encourage everyone. They always have a booth at Capitol Conference that you can also sign up for. Okay, at this point, do we have a student liaison report?
Yes.
DeAngelis.
Just a couple of quick things. First of all, I found out today on Facebook that we need to go to Fox 8 News website and vote for Euclid High School. And when I checked about 3 o'clock this afternoon, we were winning. So go to every one of your devices and do it each day. I think you're only allowed once a day. But that's from today until 5:59 a.m. Thursday morning, February 13th. The other thing coming up at the high school, which is a big thing for the high school, is this year's production of Big Show, which is March 20th through 23rd. It's Shrek the Musical. It should be a huge hit this year with kids and families, everybody involved, and I wish the best of luck to everybody, the cast, the pit, the crew, the directors. It's always fun. There's 5 shows this year, Thursday night, Friday night, 2 on Saturday, and 1 on Sunday afternoon. Tickets are going to be $12 for adults and $8 for students and seniors. Central Middle School in Forest Park, because of our calamity day a few weeks ago, their parent-teacher conferences have been moved to this Wednesday night at each of the schools. The district-wide thing is, or to be mentioned here, is this Friday, February 14th, and next Monday, February 17th, the schools are closed. The kids will be home with you, so have fun. Hopefully the weather is nice and we won't get stuck inside in this freezing cold. Now, I was handed this tonight, a winter concert. Euclid High School elementary strings players and the middle school chamber orchestra will have their winter orchestra concert on Tuesday, February 25th at 7 p.m. at Euclid High School Gymnasium. I went to this last year. It was very nice, and it's a fun event, and to see the progress, when you see the kids go from elementary school to the middle school and what progress they've made in the strings. And this is my last comment tonight. It's my personal public service announcement. If your phone number changes for any reason, please notify your school. You can either send a note in with your student or call the school secretary, because it's very important. This way you know what's happening. Your building principals can give you drop phone calls. The superintendent can call and tell you it's a snow day. Just in general information, it's very important to keep that phone number updated. I mean, no one's going to give you a hard time when you call or send a note, and they're going to be very happy and pleased that you've called in and given the updated information. It's important for all.
Thank you. Okay, at this point, are there any visitor comments relative to the agenda? Seeing none, we'll move on to reports and recommendations of the treasurer, Mr. Bassett.
Thank you, Madam President. Item 8 is a resolution to approve financial data as submitted to the board. I recommend approval.
Is there a motion?
So moved.
Moved by Mrs. Lysy, second. I'll
Second.
This by Mrs. DeAngelis. Any questions or comments? Call the roll, please.
Mrs. Sudar.
Yes.
Mrs. Thomas.
Yes.
Mrs. Van Hoen.
Yes.
Mrs. DeAngelis.
Yes.
Mrs. Lysy.
Yes.
Motion carries 5-0. Item 9 is a resolution to amend appropriations. Specifically, it's an advance from the general fund to a new Rotary fund. This is for the purpose of Mrs. Holtzman is starting a little business on the side of selling. It's a nonprofit business.
Yeah, clarify that. Rotary fund.
It's a Rotary fund. She'll be spearheading the sale of various Euclid paraphernalia and apparel, and these funds will be returned once she makes a profit, and she will. Recommend approval.
Thank you. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Moved by Mrs. Lysy, second.
Second.
By Mrs. DeAngelis. Any questions or comments? Good luck with that. We'd like to see lots of Panther stuff around town. Call the roll, please.
Mrs. Thomas.
Yes.
Mrs. Van Hoen.
Yes.
Mrs. DeAngelis.
Yes.
Mrs. Lysy.
Yes.
Mrs. Sudar.
Yes.
Motion carries 5-0.
I know we're out of order, but can I just make one comment? Scrapbooking stuff. Pat Catans used to have a lot of Panthers.
They still do.
But not as much as they used to. Yeah.
Closer to graduation, I think.
Is that when they'll have it? I say maybe throw a little bit of that in there too.
Okay. Go ahead.
Item 10 is a resolution to establish the board service fund for the year, and I recommend approval.
Is there a motion?
So moved.
Moved by Mrs. Lysy, second. Mrs. Thomas?
Second.
Okay. Are there any questions or comments? Okay, this is a matter of law. The state dictates how much money goes into this fund. Call the roll, please.
Mrs. Van Hoen.
Yes.
Mrs. DeAngelis.
Yes.
Mrs. Lysy.
Yes.
Mrs. Sudar.
Yes.
Mrs. Thomas.
Yes.
Motion carries 5-0. And item 11 is a resolution authorizing membership and payment of dues for the Ohio School Boards Association for 2014. I recommend approval.
Is there a motion?
So moved.
Moved by Mrs. DeAngelis, second. Second by Mrs. Lysy. Are there any questions or comments? Did this go up? Maybe not from last year, but it just seems like it's getting up.
It's
Seems a little high.
it's based on...
I know it's based on enrollment, yeah, so maybe that's why.
I don't know.
Okay,
It hasn't changed a whole lot if it has.
yeah. It's just noticing, keeps creeping up, like everything else. Thank you. Call the roll, please.
Mrs. DeAngelis.
Yes.
Mrs. Lysy.
Yes.
Mrs. Sudar.
Yes.
Mrs. Thomas.
Yes.
Mrs. Van Hoen.
Yes.
Motion carries 5-0, and that concludes my report.
Okay, at this point, I need to mention that number 15, which is coming up, has been revised, and the board has its revisions in front of them. Okay, at this time, we'll turn to reports and recommendations of the superintendent.
Thank you, Madam President, members of the board. I'd like to call Sue Maroney, our Human Resource Manager, to the microphone, and she will go through our recommendations on personnel. Mrs. Maroney?
Thank you, Mr. Bell. Madam President, members of the board, I present to you Resolution Number 12, Certified Staff 2013-14, and request your approval.
Thank you. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Moved by Mrs. DeAngelis, second.
Second.
By Mrs. Thomas. Thank you. Are there any questions or comments?
Can I just add one thing? Madam President, members of the board, one of the things that I know the board's used to is having a different kind of format, and I just wanted to explain that one of the reasons why the format is this way is due to the negotiated agreement with the association. We had a lot of mid-semester changes, quite a few, and so what we did was to try to make sure we had everything here. As we go back, we'll go back to that original format, but I wanted to make sure that the board was aware of why this format may look a little bit different.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Okay, now at this point, we have all the retirements for the certified staff that would be able to participate in the incentive program?
That is correct, yes. The deadline was February 1st. They can still retire after this point, but they would not be receiving the incentive.
Okay, and these people that are retiring will be working through the end of the year?
Yes, they will.
Okay, any other questions or comments? Call the roll, please.
Mrs. Lysy.
Yes.
Mrs. Sudar.
Yes.
Mrs. Thomas.
Yes.
Mrs. Van Hoen.
Yes.
Mrs. DeAngelis.
Yes.
Motion carries 5-0.
And resolution number 13 is to consider classified staff 2013-14 and ask for your approval.
Thank you. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Moved by Mrs. DeAngelis, second. Second. By Mrs. Lysy. Any questions or comments? Call the roll, please.
Mrs. Sudar.
Yes.
Mrs. Thomas.
Yes.
Mrs. Van Hoen.
Yes.
Mrs. DeAngelis.
Yes.
Mrs. Lysy.
Yes.
Motion carries 5-0.
Item number 14 is to consider summer programs, approving the appointments of the co-directors at this time, and we request your approval.
Thank you. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Moved by Mrs. DeAngelis, second.
Second.
By Mrs. Lysy, was it? Yes. Okay. Any questions or comments? How do you select them?
In this particular case, we had co-directors last year, and initially we would ask the directors if they did a fine performance, if they were interested in returning, and both did agree to return again this year.
Okay, thank you.
And also, Madam President, members of the board, they both had very, very positive evaluations, so just for
It's
the record.
important.
Yes, very important.
And this is, it gives teachers an opportunity to get some experience as an administrator.
Yes, it does.
Which is good for them.
Yeah. It'll be a little bit different this year, only in the fact that with the third grade reading guarantee, there's another component that they're going to be responsible for too. So it'll be a little bit different, but we feel real comfortable with both of those individuals.
Good. Any other questions or comments? Call the roll, please.
Mrs. Thomas.
Yes.
Mrs. Van Hoen.
Yes.
Mrs. DeAngelis.
Yes.
Mrs. Lysy.
Yes.
Mrs. Sudar.
Yes.
Motion carries 5-0.
Item number 15 is to consider the educational program reductions and additions for the 2014-2015 school year, and we request your approval.
Thank you. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Thank you. By Mrs. DeAngelis, second.
Second.
By Mrs. Thomas. Any questions or comments? Call the roll, please.
Mrs. Van Hoen.
Yes.
Mrs. DeAngelis.
Yes.
Mrs. Lysy.
Yes.
Mrs. Sudar.
Yes.
Mrs. Thomas.
Yes.
Motion carries 5-0.
And resolution number 16 is to consider classified program reductions and additions for the 2014-15 school year, and ask for your approval.
Thank you. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Moved by Mrs. DeAngelis, second.
Second.
Mrs. Lysy. You still have to get those two voices. Any questions or comments? Call the roll, please.
Mrs. De Angelis.
Yes.
Mrs. Lysy.
Yes.
Mrs. Sudar.
Yes.
Mrs. Thomas.
Yes.
Mrs. Van Hoen.
Yes.
Motion carries 5-0.
That concludes personnel section.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Maroney. Madam President, members of the board, item 17 is I'd like to consider the approval of the contract with Burgess & Burgess and ask for your approval.
Thank you. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Moved by Mrs. De Angelis, second. Second. By Mrs. Lysy. Any questions or comments?
Just like to add that Mr. Higley, myself, Mrs. Holtzman, we were involved in a very extensive interview process. I think the last meeting or last couple meetings, we had talked about a different firm out of Columbus and felt like it was very, very important that we brought individuals that were in Euclid, that had been in Euclid to the table also to be considered for that. And once we did that, we were very, very happy with how the meeting went and the direction, and we feel like that Mr. Burgess and his company can really give us what we need, and he has the energy to do what we need to have done. So feel real good about this selection. Feel good that we were able to support a Euclid business, but at the same time get exactly what we need to move forward. So we asked for approval for this.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Call the roll, please.
Mrs. Lysy.
Yes.
Mrs. Sudar.
Yes.
Mrs. Thomas.
Yes.
Mrs. Van Hoen.
Yes.
Mrs. De Angelis.
Yes.
Motion carries 5-0.
Thank you. Item 18 is to consider approval and ratification of final payment for the performance of the contract, and we're asking for approval.
Thank you. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Moved by Mrs. De Angelis, second.
Second.
By Mrs. Thomas. Are there any questions or comments?
And again, just, Madam President, members of the board, just to draw your attention, this is to complete the plumbing work at Bluestone Elementary and all aspects of the demolition project at Russell Irvine.
Thank you. Call the roll, please.
Mrs. Sudar.
Yes.
Mrs. Thomas.
Yes.
Mrs. Van Hoen.
Yes.
Mrs. De Angelis.
Yes.
Mrs. Lysy.
Yes.
Motion carries 5-0.
Thank you. Item 19 is to consider and proclaim National School Breakfast Week, and that's the week of March 3rd through the 7th, 2014, and we ask for approval.
Thank you. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Moved by Mrs. De Angelis, second.
Second.
By Mrs. Lysy. Are there any questions or comments?
Madam President, members of the board, just want to let you know that we have several exciting things planned for National School Breakfast Week. Some I don't want to disclose because Audra's just shaking her head. I don't want to disclose what they are, but there are several things that we're going to do. Some that we've done before, some will be different. We're trying to spice that up a little bit, and if you know Audra, she's got some energy behind all of this. So I think you'll be very, very pleased with what you see, and we're going to make sure that our students are out front on everything that we do there. So we'll be coming to you with some specifics later, but I just wanted to share with you that we do have a plan to make this a very, very great week.
And I bet somebody's going to contact some media to tell them about it, too.
Yeah, I imagine so.
Thank you. Any questions or comments? Call the roll, please.
Mrs. Thomas.
Yes.
Mrs. Van Hoen.
Yes.
Mrs. De Angelis.
Yes.
Mrs. Lysy.
Yes.
Mrs. Sudar.
Yes.
Motion carries 5-0.
Hey, do you have any informal?
I do. Just a couple of things. First of all, Mrs. De Angelis mentioned that school is out on the 14th and 17th. Just want the public to know that the offices will be open on the 14th. So even though students won't be here, the offices will still be open. The other thing, I just wanted to just give my appreciation to those individuals that attended the fireside chat, and also to Mrs. Holtzman, who teed that up very well for me. We had a very good turnout. It wasn't a great night, but we had some very quality discussion, very, very good questions, and appreciated the feedback. So I just want to just tell those folks that I really appreciate you taking the time to come out. The other thing that you may have seen is that the mayor and I will be putting together a television show. And it is to try to do everything we can to communicate to the community what's going on. The taping, I believe, is tomorrow. And we're still working on the dates that it will be shown. And I just wanted to draw attention to that because the objective there is to be able to communicate with the community, to be able to get our message across in a different way. So we're really looking for the public to give us some feedback on what they like, what they don't like, so we can tweak that to continue to make that effective. Last week, we had Professional Day on February 4th, and the public might be wondering, well, what were they doing on February 4th? What was really going on in the district? And I just want to give you an idea of some of the different things that were occurring today. The outcome, our expected outcome that day was to really try to improve our instructional strategies, really work as a group, and it gave teachers an opportunity to talk to each other. But specifically, what we tried to cover instructionally was differentiated instruction, really try to tighten down our evaluation process. For those of you who don't know, we have a new evaluative tool that we're using this year that we really want to make sure is giving us the desired results. So we had an opportunity to be able to talk a little bit about that. And we also had an opportunity to be able to look at our instructional practices and look at what's working, what's not, and be able to have some professional development in that area. Additionally, our Pupil Services Department really did a great job in assisting our staff and understanding about what's going on legally and giving us a legal update, along with some special education compliance concerns, as well as a 504 workshop, which really, I think, is helpful for everyone throughout the district. These are things that you can't necessarily get to at this degree of expertise on a daily, with your daily schedule, because you don't have the time. This gave us the time to be able to do that. So I just wanted the public to know that we spent a great deal of time to try to make sure that we sharpened our practice, to make sure that we're all singing the same song, so to speak, that we all understand where we're going. And also, Mrs. Miller, who's not here because she is attending the third grade reading guarantee meetings that had to be switched because of some calamity days we had. What we've done is try to develop a professional development plan that fits our goals and objectives for the district. So everything works together, and this gives us an opportunity to be able to do that. So I just think it's important for the general public to understand what we're doing. We, with us being out of school, people might ask, well, we could have had school that day. What are we doing? It's very, very important that our teachers get this professional development so that they can then sharpen their craft, so that they can help students to be able to get to where they need to be. And did a great job. It was a very good, a great effort by our team to be able to put that together, and also inexpensive for us because we don't have to ship people away. We can do that in-house. And we were able to bring people here and do it all at once. So very, very positive day. So, Madam President, members of the board, that's my info.
For the general public's sake, we toss around a lot of terms in board meetings and when you're talking with staff and so forth. What do you mean by the term differentiated instruction?
Great question. What that means is, Madam President, members of the board, is that we tier our instruction to be able to get to different skill sets and different levels of student development. For example, if a student is reading at a lower level and one student is reading at a higher level, we differentiate our instruction so that we can reach both students to take them from wherever they are to where they need to be. The higher student needs to be able to still perform, whereas the lower student, they need to be brought up, but both of them need to have quality instruction. The differentiation strategies are different depending on the coursework, and there are skills that are associated with how to get the maximum performance. If you look at any research, the quadrant where we really struggle is the upper level quadrant of our students, because when they are at that level, the type of work that they need and the skill, the type of instruction is different than what it is for other students. So what it does for us is it provides us an opportunity to be able to give all students an opportunity to grow and being able to understand what those strategies are. The second part of that is that the professional development day allowed us an opportunity to practice and be able to see what's happening in other buildings so that we can see what's working and what's not. We can tweak that, we can see results, we get a chance to look at data to be able to determine what's working and what's not. And when you look at where our kids are on the spectrum, it makes a lot of sense for us to be able to really get tight around that instructional piece and really be tight around getting kids where they need to be and continuing to move them forward. So differentiation is just kind of just like it sounds, being a different instruction, almost like an individual educational plan for each student.
I think that's where people in the public remember that they used to say everybody taught to the middle group and the slow kids, and the upper kids were bored. This is a way of making sure that the lower level kids are brought up to where they need to be, and then the upper level kids are also challenged.
Can I add one thing?
Sure.
too? One of the things that the public needs to know too is the fact that we're measured as a district on the state report card by how we reduce the achievement gap. You can't reduce the achievement gap unless you adjust or really get in and look at the differentiation of how kids learn, because that's where the achievement gap centers. And so what we're trying to do is to make sure that we don't have a gap between our highest performing students, or we minimize the gap between our highest performing students and our lower achieving students, that we get growth in all levels. And so there is a measurement indicator that challenges us to make sure that we're addressing that the way we need to.
I know that we do an excellent job with our report card is showing on the low level students, but that we still have some work to do on our gifted students. However, I found it very interesting. The public needs to know that when the state's judging you, they're looking at, do you get a year's worth of growth out of the students in a year's time? And if you do, you get a C. And then B and A goes according to whether you're doing more than a year's worth of growth, and a D and an F means less than a year's worth of growth. And there was an article on Facebook that talked about a school that I won't name, but it's boasting, it is the School for Gifted Children in Cleveland. And their ranking was an F for their gifted students, which meant that they aren't anywhere close to getting their year's worth of growth out of those students. Ours was a C. So we still have room to grow, but at least they're getting a year's worth of growth in a year. And I find sometimes that people are making choices to go to some of these schools because they have a nice fancy brochure or they say the right things, but when you actually look at what the statistics are, the state gave them an F, and it was making Facebook news because of the fact that how could you have an F when you're supposed to be dealing with the gifted students? And it's because of that growth measurement. And so, you know, when you're considering those alternative schools, you really need to look at the growth that the students are getting, because that really makes a huge difference. And it's, you know, you can't say that the thought for a while in education was, oh, don't worry about the gifted kids, they'll make it anyhow. But they might not be growing as much as they could. They're not being challenged enough, because these are the students that you consider down the road are going to be your doctors and lawyers and nurses and teachers and so forth. So you want them to get the best education possible.
Madam President, members of the board too, the overall, for all students, we received an A in our, so we're accurate, in our growth, which means that not only are we getting a year's worth of growth, but in many cases, more than a year's worth of growth, which bodes us well because we have many students that come in more than a year behind. So it almost looks like a wash, because when you have them come in behind like they do, and we get 2 years worth of growth, we're really not getting the amount of resilience we get if students came in on grade level. If they came in on grade level and we got 2 years worth of growth, we'd really be higher. So our teachers really do a great job of making sure that they recognize, and that's the differentiation piece, recognizing where students are, regardless of what level, and then taking them from that particular level to the next level, whatever that is, and continuing to move them forward. So we're really pleased with that, not satisfied, but pleased with the growth, and are continuing to work to move things forward.
Thank you. Do we have any communications or petitions?
We do not.
Any new or old business?
We do not.
Any board members informal? Anyone? Other than, hopefully, we really don't need any additional calamity days, but we'll keep our fingers crossed, because we still have a long way to go to get through winter, as we all know. Are there any visitor comments? Seeing none, I'll take a motion to adjourn.
I motion to adjourn.
Moved by Mrs. DeAngelis, second by Mrs. Lysy. Call the roll, please.
Mrs. Van Hoen.
Yes.
Mrs. DeAngelis.
Yes.
Mrs. Lysy.
Yes.
Mrs. Sudar.
Yes.
Mrs. Thomas.
Yes.
Motion carries 5-0.
Thank you. Thank you all.
I ask a question.